Segment 3 of Chapter 2 picks up continuing talking about the different features of the brain. So it picks up with the parietal lobe, which is part of the brain that receives sensory information from the body and helps with spatial cognition. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal cortex and is posterior to the central sulcus, and it receives somatosensory information from the entire body. The frontal lobe is involved in movement and high-level cognition. The precentral gyrus is part of the frontal cortex and is anterior to the central sulcus and helps with motor control. The lobes of the brain are continuously communicating with one another to produce thoughts and behaviors. The corpus callosum is a structure in the middle of the brain made of axons that connects the right and left hemispheres. The cortex of the brain is made up of gray and white matter. The more outer layer of the brain is made of gray matter, which contains neuronal cell bodies and dendrites without myelin, and primarily receive and process information. White matter, on the other hand, is the inner layer of the brain under the cortex. It consists of myelinated axons, which give it its white color, and they mostly transmit information. Next, the chapter goes on to talk about the developmental subdivisions of the brain. So, the brain begins in any vertebrate as a neural tube, so the CNS of an embryo has subdivisions that correspond to the developing forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The forebrain, or the prosencephalon, is the anterior division of the brain that contains the two cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The midbrain, or the mesencephalon, is the middle division of the brain, and the hindbrain, or the rhombencephalon, is the posterior division of the brain that contains the cerebellum, pons, and medulla. Within and between regions of the brain, there are collections of neurons called nuclei and bundles of axons called tracts. For the most part, our brains are bilaterally symmetrical. Most structures are paired, so there's one on the left and one on the right. Each side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body, so the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. The cerebral cortex performs complex cognitive processing, and the chapter talks about the fact that there are 6 distinct layers of the cerebral cortex. But certain parts of the cerebral cortex are considered allocortex, which is cortical tissue with only 3 layers or unlayered organization rather than the 6. Pyramidal cells are the most prominent kind of neuron in the cerebral cortex. Subcortical structures are involved in movement and the regulation of emotions, so the basal ganglia is important in motor control, and the basal ganglia is composed of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the substantia nigra. The limbic system, another subcortical structure, is responsible for emotions and learning. The limbic system is composed of the amygdala, mammillary bodies, the hippocampus, the fornix, septal nuclei, cingulate gyrus, olfactory bulb, and the stria terminalis. The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus directs all incoming sensory information to the appropriate regions of the cortex, whereas the hypothalamus plays a role in vital functions such as hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, etc. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland, which is very important. The midbrain has both sensory and motor components, and its main structures are the tectum, the superior colliculi, the inferior colliculi, the red nucleus, and the reticular formation. The cerebellum is attached to the pons and helps with motor coordination and some aspects of cognition. The medulla marks the transition from the brain to the spinal cord. And there's a specialized support system that protects and nourishes the brain. So our meninges are the 3 protective sheets of tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord, and the outermost is the dura mater, followed by the pia mater, and the innermost is the arachnoid. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, fills cerebral ventricles and runs through the ventricular system, which are cavities in the brain. CSF acts as both a shock absorber and as a medium for exchange of materials. The ventricular system is comprised of 2 lateral ventricles on either side of the brain, a 3rd ventricle and a 4th ventricle. And the lateral ventricles have the choroid plexus, which is a specialized membrane lining the lateral ventricles.